Boss forced me to quit or lose my $25,000 bonus. I said, keep it. Then dropped a legal bomb that destroyed his plan. So I used to work at this tech company based in Denver. The company's job was pretty straightforward. We handled IT services for small businesses that didn't have their own tech teams. I'd been there for nearly 5 years, starting as a junior tech and working my way up to a senior position. It wasn't glamorous, but I liked the work. Plus, I'd worked my tail off to get where I was. For most of my time there, things were good. My boss at the time, Mitch, was one of those rare decent people in management who actually cared about his employees. He had founded the company, treated us with respect, and made sure we were taken care of. I liked Mitch, and under his leadership, the company thrived. But about a year before this all went down, Mitch decided it was time to retire. He sold the company to some big investment group, who then installed their own guy to run the show, Frank. Frank was. Well, let's just say Frank was a piece of work. The moment he showed up, he started talking about efficiency and restructuring and how he had a vision for the company. The problem? His vision basically involved making cuts wherever he could to pump up the numbers, ignoring what actually made the company good in the first place. He wanted more work with less people, faster turnarounds, lower costs, and higher profits. And he didn't care who he stepped on to get there. I wasn't too worried at first. I'd been around a while, had a solid reputation, and my performance reviews had always been stellar. I was confident that as long as I kept doing my job, I'd be fine. But after a few months, I started noticing some red flags. Frank wasn't subtle about his goal to trim the fat from the company. He started giving people impossible workloads, denying time off requests, and making the work environment miserable. People started leaving in droves, but Frank didn't care. In his eyes, every person who quit was one less salary he had to pay. Then, one day, out of the blue, Frank called me into his office. He gave me this big smile, acted all friendly, and then hit me with the line, "Hey, we need to talk about your performance." My gut dropped right there. I knew I'd been doing my job well, if not above and beyond. I mean, I had the hours, projects, and client feedback to prove it. But the way he was looking at me, I could tell this wasn't a real conversation about my performance. Frank starts this whole spiel about how I'm not meeting expectations and how he's concerned about my commitment to the company. I let him go on, all the while thinking, is this guy serious? But I kept my mouth shut, just nodded along, letting him dig his own grave. Then, after a few minutes of vague complaints, he finally drops the bomb. "We're offering you the opportunity to resign," he says, like he's doing me some big favor. "It'll look better on your record if you leave voluntarily." I wasn't buying it for a second. I'd been there long enough to know that I was in line for a $25,000 bonus at the end of the year, an incentive Mitch had set up for long-term employees. Frank wanted me to walk away before that bonus payout so he wouldn't have to cut the check. Classic move. I looked at him and said, "I'm not interested in resigning." He raised his eyebrows, looking surprised that I wasn't caving instantly. He tried to act cool, but I could see he wasn't expecting me to push back. "Well," he said, leaning back in his chair, "then we may have to initiate a performance review process. It might end up with you being terminated if your performance doesn't improve." He gave me this smug look, like he had me backed into a corner. But what he didn't know was that I wasn't about to roll over that easily. I left his office, sat down at my desk, and took a deep breath. If he wanted to play dirty, I was ready. I decided to fight back, but I needed to be smart about it. I started gathering everything I had. Over the years, I'd held on to every single performance review, email, and positive feedback I'd received from clients and even from Frank himself. I wanted everything I could get to prove that I wasn't underperforming as he claimed. Over the next few days, Frank started making my life even harder. He'd give me impossible deadlines, then criticize me for not meeting them. He'd schedule meetings at odd hours, demand updates at a moment's notice, and generally make my workload as miserable as possible. It was obvious he was trying to push me to quit. I kept calm. Every time he gave me an impossible task, I documented it. Every ridiculous email, every change in my workload, every absurd request, I saved it all. I even started a log on my phone, writing down every interaction I had with him. I knew this might come in handy down the road. After about a month of this nonsense, I decided it was time to consult a lawyer. I'd never actually needed one before, but I wasn't about to let Frank bully me out of my job and my bonus. So, I found a local employment lawyer, Jim, who had a reputation for dealing with corporate bullies like Frank. Jim listened to everything I had to say, looked over all the documentation I had collected, and then gave me a grin. He said, "You have a solid case here. If they fire you without going through a proper, documented process, we can go after them for wrongful termination. And if they're pushing you to resign to avoid paying your bonus, that could be considered coercion." Hearing this was music to my ears. Jim told me to keep my head down, keep doing my job, and let Frank dig his own grave. So that's exactly what I did. I went back to work, dealt with Frank's nonsense, and waited. About a week before my bonus was set to be paid out, Frank pulled me into his office again. This time, he had the HR manager, Sarah, with him. She looked uncomfortable, like she knew this was shady. Frank started the same old song and dance, saying he didn't see improvement and that tough decisions were going to have to be made. Sarah handed me a performance improvement plan and asked me to sign it. I looked it over. It was full of vague criticisms and ridiculous goals, none of which were based on my actual job performance. I calmly put the paper down and said, "I'm not signing this." Frank looked like he was about to explode. He said, "If you refuse to sign, we may have to consider other actions. Are you sure you want to do this?" I looked him straight in the eye and said, "Yes, I'm sure." I went back to my desk, knowing things were about to escalate. Sure enough, a couple of days later, I got an email from HR scheduling a final review meeting. It didn't take a genius to figure out that they were planning to fire me right before my bonus payout. But this time, I was ready. Before the meeting, I forwarded all my documentation, emails, performance reviews, every absurd request Frank had made, to my lawyer, Jim. I also filed a complaint with the Colorado Department of Labor, explaining how they were withholding my earned bonus as a way to push me out. The day of the meeting, I walked in, sat down, and waited. Frank and Sarah started their little show, talking about my ongoing performance issues and how, unfortunately, they were going to have to let me go. Then, right as Frank was about to pull out the termination paperwork, I interrupted him. I told them I had filed a formal complaint for wrongful termination, backed by all the documentation I had collected over the months. I watched as Frank's face fell. Sarah looked like she wanted to be anywhere else. I left the meeting and called Jim to let him know how it went. After that final review meeting where I dropped the legal bomb, things got intense. The company was now facing a formal complaint with the Colorado Department of Labor, and they knew I wasn't bluffing. Within a couple of days, I got a call from Jim. He told me that the company's legal team had reached out to him to try and resolve the issue quietly. Basically, they were scared of the complaint becoming a big problem, so they wanted to handle it before things got worse. A few days later, I was called back into the office for another meeting. This time, it wasn't just Frank and Sarah. There was someone from corporate HR and one of the company's lawyers sitting at the table. Frank, who usually loved to control the room, was quiet and looking down, avoiding eye contact. Corporate HR started talking, saying they wanted to clear up any misunderstandings and find a mutually beneficial resolution. They offered me a generous severance package, which was just slightly above my bonus, if I agreed to leave quietly and not pursue my complaint any further. They thought I'd be happy with a little extra cash and would walk away quietly. But they didn't know that Jim and I had already discussed this kind of lowball offer. I'd worked my tail off for years, and they were trying to push me out while avoiding the consequences. I wasn't about to make it easy for them. I looked them right in the eye and said, "That offer isn't enough. Not after everything Frank put me through. I have all the documentation proving I did my job well and was targeted unfairly. If you want this to go away quietly, you'll need to do a lot better than that." The lawyer looked surprised, but I could tell they were nervous. They stepped out of the room to discuss and came back a few minutes later with a much better offer. This time, they offered $50,000, twice the amount of my bonus. They also agreed to let me leave with a neutral reference, which meant I wouldn't have to worry about any lies Frank might spread to future employers. I was tempted, but I still didn't accept right away. I told them, "I'll think about it and let you know." That night, I called Jim, and we talked it over. He told me that if we kept pushing, we could probably get more, especially given the lengths they'd gone to try and force me out. We decided to go for one more round of negotiations and see what else they'd give up to make this problem disappear. So, the next day, Jim sent them a letter demanding $100,000 as a final settlement. We also included a demand that Frank be disciplined or removed, arguing that his behavior was a liability to the company. I wasn't expecting them to actually fire Frank. I figured they'd just ignore that part, but I was ready to see how far they'd go to protect him. A few days passed, and then Jim got a call from their lawyer. They accepted the $100,000 offer. But the best part? They agreed to reassign Frank to another division. Turns out, they'd finally realized that he was more trouble than he was worth, especially since he'd already scared off a lot of good employees and made the company look bad. The day after we finalized the settlement, I came into the office to pack up my things. Word had spread about Frank's reassignment, and people were whispering, trying to piece together what had happened. I didn't say much, just packed up, said goodbye to a few friends, and walked out feeling like I'd finally won. As I was leaving the building, I bumped into Frank in the lobby. He looked at me, completely defeated, and mumbled something about wishing me the best. I didn't say anything, just smiled, nodded, and kept walking. It felt like the perfect ending to everything he'd put me through. With the settlement money in my account, I took a few weeks off to relax and clear my head. I eventually landed a new job with a boss who actually respects me, and I'm happier than I've been in years. The whole experience taught me a lot about standing up for myself and not letting people like Frank push me around. To anyone dealing with a terrible boss, keep your head up, gather your evidence, and don't let them bully you. Sometimes, the best revenge is just knowing your worth and making them pay for trying to take advantage of you.